I think it's on.
Can you hear me now?
Let me check my hair and my makeup and get going. Well, as I started to say before we found out the mic wasn't on, at the first City Commission in November, I requested that staff and the City Attorney review the November vote on the Melton property and provide the Commission with options to go forward on this matter. That was accomplished by way of the memo to the City Commission received last week from the City Attorney and the City Manager, and you all have the opportunity to review it fully, I take it. I would like to have the City Attorney go over the options in the memo with the City Commission. And then once that is completed, the City Commission can make comments or ask questions. We won't take any action today, but we can tomorrow at tomorrow's commission meeting, and I hope we can move in that direction also, I think. But before council begins, I want to ask the commission that during public input after the work session, please do not make any attempt to debate or answer public questions. We are in litigation at this point. Our situation actually places us in a position where I could call for a closed session in this matter to discuss pending litigation. However, we will discuss this in a public forum. Counsel?
Mr. Mayor and Commission, thank you. Before getting into the essence of the memorandum that you have from both Mr. Mercedes and myself, there is one substantive change, which is when this memo was drafted and circulated, we had a copy of a draft complaint, and the memo references the essence of that draft complaint. Since then, they have filed suit. We have approximately 14 more days before we need to file an answer. So it is imperative upon this body to give direction tomorrow night, because you don't meet again until the second Tuesday, obviously in January, which will be after the 21 days that we have to file an answer. Having said that, we have attempted to bring to you by way of background that we are talking about a site that has been an industrial site for in excess of 100 years. It has been sold by S.D. Warren to Melching Incorporated, subject to a number of deed restrictions, covenants, and obligations that Melching has to Sappy, that what was brought before you this year was an initiatory petition, and frankly the comments that were made both before and after the election have changed somewhat as to what the intent of the proponents were. As you'll recall, many of the comments especially early on, were that the initiatory petition was intended as simply an indication of what they would like the City Commission to do, what action they would like the city to take. The more recent comments have been, now that the voters have spoken, this is what you must do. That has put us in the city in a position of, we either need to proceed on the litigation, and we have outlined several options as to that litigation. The first, we could take the position of some of the early proponents that it is simply advisory, and we could indicate to Melching we agree it's not binding on us, the litigation is essentially done, the rezoning would not, would be consistent with what it is right now, which is I-2, or industrial use. Alternatively, we can oppose that litigation, and so essentially, no, we think the voters have spoken, this is what the zoning is, subject to some qualifications that I'm going to have in a couple minutes. We would certainly encourage the proponents to participate in this lawsuit, because whatever the decision of the judge is, as to whether this is binding or simply advisory, is binding on all of the city residents. It's not just binding on Melching and us, it's going to apply to everybody. So if you truly are interested in this, the time to do something is to join the litigation now. They do that by hiring a counsel and filing a motion to intervene. Whether the judge would let them intervene or not, I don't know. But if they want to participate and they want to say this is important to us, that's their remedy. We have also laid out for you that it may be appropriate to consider having SAPI join in this litigation. And the reason we lay that out as an option to think about and look at is if we fight the litigation and if we prevail, Melching loses, and this is going to become zone waterfront marine, it has serious implications on the deed restrictions and the other restrictions included in the deed from SD Warren to Melching. For instance, it makes it very difficult to have an entire portion of this property, which the public is not supposed to be on, subject to the deed restrictions, and yet it's zoned for a hotel and restaurant. Which one's it gonna be, Judge? It's tough to do both. Whether we wish to pursue that by adding SAPI to this litigation obviously compounds and makes the litigation substantially more difficult, substantial and probably more expensive, but it is something, if we're gonna go through this fight, and we're gonna fight this, you know, we need to consider that as a possibility. We have also outlined for you options for the City Commission after the litigation is completed. Those include, in particular, if the zone change is not valid, if the court rules with Melching that it is not a proper way to amend the zoning ordinance, then certainly the City Commission can direct city staff to start the process on rezoning the property. And that's by way of a staff recommendation, staff investigation, recommendation, what should the appropriate zoning be, hearings in front of the Planning Commission, both normal meetings, but also, I presume, especially the context of this, there will be one or more public hearings, a recommendation from the Planning Commission to the City Commission as to a potential zone change, and presumably a vote by this body at some point in the future. Likewise, there's some other options that can be pursued either as part of that or as staff with Melching, and those are things like contract zoning, and likewise convincing Melching that it's in their interest to submit a PUD. The problem on both of those is they are going to be time-consuming and problematic. Problematic in the sense that Doug Melching has told you, his representatives have told you, and they have indicated to others, they have somewhat of a difficult time coming forward with a PUD or a contract zoning when they don't have somebody in place ready to go to do something. They are concerned about binding themselves in to say, in this 10 acres, we will do X, when they don't have anybody to do anything on the entire 100 acres, other than what he is doing now, which is basically deconstruction, nominal amounts of other industrial uses, which don't result in any buildings being built, etc. That will be difficult for them, probably in a better position as time goes on, to be able to say, okay, I now have somebody that wants these 5 acres, these 20 acres, thus I know I can agree to a zone change contractually or by way of a PUD to do something in this one particular area. I still don't know what I want to do with the rest, but we can sort of piecemeal that. And certainly that has been consistent with a number of other large tracts of property where developers have come and said, we aren't really sure, you know, give us some flexibility. We need to work with some stuff. And come back and forth, you know, to this body, to city staff, etc. I am certainly happy to answer any questions that the Commissioner Mayor might have. I'm sure Mr. Mazzetti would also. Or further expound on something.
Well, my key question is, I mean, given that we're going to be spending, no offense to you or your profession, but since this has happened, we will be spending money on lawyers, and a lot of money that we don't have. Is it all an academic exercise? Because, you know, unless I'm missing something after being on the Planning Commission for 11 years, there hasn't been an abandonment of the historic use, and whether we had rezoned this to something different in 2009 or last year or tomorrow, that doesn't change the right of the current property owner to use the property for his current zoned uses as a legal non-conforming use. So could you, am I wrong?
No, you're right. Commission, what Commissioner Spataro is specifically dealing with is footnote 1 on page 3, which talks about that a property owner has a vested right in the existing zoning. And all successor owners have that same vested right. Simply because there's been a transfer from one owner to another does not eliminate the legal non-conforming status of real property. The zoning change stays with the property, etc. So that even if we changed it today, or a circuit court agreed with us and ruled that mulching was wrong, it doesn't change the fact that mulching and successor owners continue to be able to use it for industrial property. Where we are going to have the possibility of future litigation is exactly what does that mean on exactly what piece of property, and are we going to have fights over, well, in this 1 acre, you didn't use it for industrial, it was parking lot. Does that make it part of industrial, or are we gonna try and take the position that it doesn't? This was an office. It's connected to the industrial, the office's sole purpose was to service the industrial use. Does that mean that it's industrial or not? Are we going to litigate every one of those? If the litigation ends with Melching is correct that the initiatory petition is not a way to change the zoning, we can resolve some of those issues by way of either contract zoning, where the parties agree that this area will be used as offices, this area will be used for open to the public, etc. And I'm being hypothetical on what those might be. But if Melching and us agree, then that whole issue of the legal non-conforming is not going to keep getting litigated in those areas, because the parties have agreed. And essentially Melching has agreed, I'm willing to give up industrial for this portion, and city, that's acceptable. But otherwise, you're right, we're going to have litigation, at least the potential, for some period of time.
Commissioner Markowski?
Regarding the land transfer, does that apply if it is sold as one contiguous piece of land, or if it's also divided up?
Doesn't matter. It may change the likelihood of succeeding in litigation on whether or not it's the legal non-conforming. If we're, for instance, we're talking about just the office, and the office was used as an office before and is used as an office later, it may make our argument a little better, but as a strict legal proposition, it doesn't matter.
Commissioner Turnquist?
Is there any advantage to wait to see what the circuit court decides and then plan our next step?
Well, what the circuit court does next depends on what we do. If we don't file an answer, then a default will enter, I would assume in about 22 days, and an order entering that Melching is right because the city has not filed an answer to it.
So we have to either be for or against
Yes.
what's on the table.
Yep.
We just can't be mute and wait to see what the circuit court decides.
With probably one exception. If within the next 21 days, a group of citizens file a motion to intervene and are granted the opportunity to intervene, and they defend the city's action, then that litigation would go forward. I would not expect that to happen within what now is probably a 14-day window. That would be unusual. Normally, interveners come in after an answer is filed. They need time to hire counsel, get counsel up to speed, etc.
Go right ahead, Commissioner. Follow-up question.
Well, this is to Brian probably. I've been told that, over this time frame, we have had some communication and negotiations with Melching, Mr. Melching. Has he changed his position during this time at all? Do you see a spot where he might soften, or is he very, very adamant about his stand, which was adamant to paper?
I haven't had a conversation with him or representatives from his company recently, and it's probably due to the fact that vote was passed, or the proposal for was passed in the guess he was preoccupied with this matter.
Council, you have set out options A, B, C, and D as far as response to pending litigation.
Yes, sir.
Now, if we lean more to one of the specifics, A, B, or C, could we also include adding SAPI into, or would there be a benefit to that? Let's say if I was leaning towards option C, where we litigate the issue and encourage the proponents of the initiatory petition to join the litigation, would there be any benefit as well as adding SAPI, or do they stand alone?
No, I don't view, in my mind, it's A or B, and if you do B, it's B, B and C, B, C and D, B and D.
All the
Any
above?
of those are fine. Once we decide we're in this lawsuit, we're in for the fight. And I think there are benefits, and that doesn't probably have to get decided tomorrow night, whether we add, or other than direct us to start looking at ways to get SAPI as part of this litigation. I think there is merit to the circuit judge being able to look at also the deed restrictions and say, okay, if I'm gonna impose, if the city's zoning ordinance is going to be effective and it's gonna impose these obligations on Melching, I've gotta figure out a way to relieve them of some of the obligations under the deed restrictions. I judge whomever, cannot put Melching Incorporated in a position that they can't comply with both the zoning and the deed restrictions. Would expose us to substantial financial exposure. I.e. a taking.
You're not saying it's not possible, it just wouldn't make much sense for the
I-
judge to decide that.
It would be possible, and then the second lawsuit would be Melching saying, I want money. I can't use this property for anything anymore, or some portion of it.
We have the manager.
Can I just say something in response to what a question that Commissioner Turnquist asked earlier about waiting? Could we wait? I think there's really maybe two questions there, or two issues there. One is with respect to the litigation, and as Mr. Schreier said, we really need to move forward and make a decision on what we're going to do in that regard. But then the second piece of that really is what do we do with the potential rezoning of the site after the litigation? And I think what Mr. Schreier is saying is we can wait, we really wait until after the litigation is resolved to determine what steps we take in that regard. If that helps.
Council, if we did select option C, where we encourage the proponents to enter as well, how would that contact be made, or what would be the mechanism for them to enter?
I think city staff probably could notify representatives of the proponents. I think they're sitting in this room. I think they have also probably read the MLive articles, probably made comments on the MLive articles. So knowing that if they really care about this, they better get involved, shouldn't be a big shock. What they will have to do is retain counsel, and there's gonna have to be an organized group, or an individual could do it. But they're going to have to retain counsel, and counsel is going to have to file a motion to intervene. It'll get scheduled for a hearing before the judge. Presumably our position would be, we have no objection to the intervention. I don't know what Melching's position would be. And if Melching objects, then the court will decide. Do they get to intervene or not? Do they have an interest different than ours and different than Melching's? And I would, this case, if they can articulate that this group of people, individuals, corporate body, whatever, were proponents of this petition and did things to push it, they may well have sufficient standing to intervene.
Vice Mayor?
This is a question for the manager. I just heard that regardless of the choices we make, unless we negotiate a change with the Doug Melching, that basically this is a legal non-conforming use, regardless of what we rezone this to, unless there is a change in state law or the judge issues a precedent that would have the effect of changing state law. So my concern becomes financial. We have to protect the financial interests of the citizens of this city. And, you know, we have another matter before us tonight that we wouldn't even be discussing if we had the same revenue that we did 5 years ago. So my concern is, so we can help make a more informed choice on which of these options that have been suggested we take, is what is our obligation out of pocket for legal bills? And is this something that would be covered by our risk management coverage, or are we, because of the nature of this type of litigation, are we exposed to the full cost of the legal bills?
I think you asked several questions, let me try to answer.
It all comes down to money.
With respect to the amount of money that would be spent on this litigation, it's really anybody's guess, but I think what Mr. Schreier tried to point out is certain options would probably carry a different financial burden to the city. One, I think he points out in that under that scenario, it would probably be much quicker, it wouldn't be as expensive. We kind of went through that, but you know, even in that case, finite dollar amount is not attached to that. I think it's difficult to attach a finite dollar amount to the litigation.
Well, I'm thinking in terms of, I believe only the mayor was here at the time to remember this. We went through a eminent domain taking that kind of blew up in everybody's face. And those legal bills quickly hit over $250,000. That was out of pocket. And that's what I'm looking at is worst case scenario, you know, what's our maximum out-of-pocket exposure for this? Or is there at some point when our risk management, I mean, you know, if it's technically there isn't a limit because it's not covered by risk management at all, that's what I'm getting at.
Okay, I think I'm following you now, and I may need to ask him for some help here, but what we do in cases like this when lawsuits are filed, we provide these lawsuits to our risk management group, which is essentially our insurance company. And then they determine whether or not there's coverage for the claim. I don't believe that they have made that determination yet. And I think it's indicated in here that we think that they probably will not, that they will probably deny coverage because of the type of claim. If that is the case, then we will be responsible for whatever the costs there are with this case. Even if they do provide coverage, we have a retained amount that would be deductible, if you will. And I believe Tim, how many is it, $100,000? $150,000. So we will pay the first $150,000 of the litigation.
And that's assuming that they actually say we'll cover this litigation.
Correct. I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question.
Right. No, but that, I mean, when we're making these decisions, I think we need to know the dollar amounts of what we're talking about, particularly in light of the other financial choices that we have to make over the course of the year. That every dollar spent on this litigation is a dollar that's not available for something that's very important for the, you know, the benefit of the citizens of this city and the operations as far as things that we take for granted, like potholes getting filled and the grass getting mowed in the parks and things like that. So, thank you.
I don't know if this is a appropriate comment at this time, but I just look at that property as so much potential for the city of Muskegon. And it seems to me that we're drawing a line in the sand, and some are on that side, some are on this side, and good solutions involve some compromise. We've talked about some things, and this is a wild idea, and I have no idea whether it will be accepted or not, but the west end of that property really has nothing on it from what we can see from the road. The citizens would like to have access to the lake from Lakeshore. We have had a number of inquiries about people wanting to buy Fisherman's Landing down at the other end. I don't think we've ever had any opposition that that's more of an industrial site down there. If that kind of situation exists, with the people who are promoting the rezoning, if the city were to buy the west end, I don't know how many acres, and offer to relocate Fisherman's Landing in that end, providing access to the water to everybody, and still have some commercial, because we're going to need income in the city. And I don't know, standing hard and fast is I don't think is good. I think there has to be some solutions that's good for the people and good for the city.
Vice Mayor.
I don't think the seven of us up here are standing hard and fast. I mean, let's think back to how this has played out up to this point. We insisted that there be a master plan for this site. Mr. Melching, after some reluctance, has been negotiating with SAPI, with the DEQ, with the city of Muskegon on the long-term plans for the use of this site, including mixed use. So, I mean, from the very get-go, there has been a willingness to be flexible, I think, on our part and on his part. But we were forced into this situation that instead of allowing this to play out over the course of 2 to 3 years, which is what it would typically take with something this big, this complex. I mean, it's at least a year before he's even finished with demolition. It's probably a year after that before the DEQ signs off on anything going there at all. So, you know, instead of allowing ourselves to take advantage of that time that is going to be there regardless, to negotiate an outcome that is acceptable to the property owner, acceptable to the community, we've been put into a situation where we're being asked to force an issue instead of negotiate an issue. And from my perspective, when you start forcing things against people involuntarily, you usually end up with much worse results. I mean, and I don't disagree that having the west end available or parts of that site available for public access would be wonderful. I don't know how we do that without buying the property, and I'm not sure how we buy the property unless somebody gives us a lot of money. So I think we would be better served and would be demonstrating more flexibility by trying to settle this lawsuit as inexpensively as possible and continue to negotiate with the property owner for a positive outcome from the community. I don't see that as being inflexible. I see that as being flexible.
Well, I see it as buying the property by selling Fisherman's Landing.
We can't sell Fisherman's Landing. The way that was funded, that uses state and federal funds. They have final say on whether or not that property can be what's called converted. So we went through that exercise once 10 years ago where a private developer provided land at their own expense, was going to build a duplicate facility at their own expense, and the people who control the deed restrictions on Fisherman's Landing said no. So even with that, they certainly would not allow us to, you know, use public dollars to do that, because public dollars were used to create Fisherman's Landing in the first place. So I mean, I understand where you're coming from that, but I don't see that as a viable way of generating money to buy a portion of this property.
And before we start talking about potential collaborations, cooperations, and development of the property, we have this little bugaboo called a lawsuit that we have to wade through. And what occurs with lawsuits is that parties don't talk, and now we have to go see the judge.
Out of fairness, I am comfortable that our office and Mr. Melching or Melching Incorporated's council will have ongoing conversations. I think the mayor's point, though, is right, is in the absence of a decision, both parties are going to be coming from a different perspective. There may be a willingness to try and do something, but we think we're right, they think they're right. Both can't be right. And who's got the power is part of that conversation.
I'm not sure.
And it runs its own time schedule. Litigation runs on its own schedule. This type of case, probably, I would guess, a resolution late spring, early summer.
I'm sorry, from what I was reading in the memo, I wasn't sure that I garnered that there was any option of, direct settlement prior to just allowing it to be litigated.
I think
Whether or not that you would consider whether it was even an option.
it is always an option. I don't think it's a very, I would not, at this point in time, I certainly would not want to tell you, I think this case is going to get resolved, because I think I'd be misleading you at this point.
Mr. Manager?
I guess maybe to dovetail on what John said, though, I think a settlement could include a couple things that Mr. Schreier said earlier, and that with respect to contract zoning or a negotiated PUD.
So commissioners, as we're, Commissioner Turnquist, please.
Irregardless, as we as a city decide to go in one direction or the other direction, and the zoning gets changed, Mr. Melching still has the option to continue on with I-2. That's, I think your statement was earlier.
If it is done without his consent, if we do it by way of a contract zoning or something like that, or he comes and the parties agree to a PUD that calls for industrial in this area, commercial in this area, etc., then we avoid what I'm going to refer to as almost the second round of litigation, because he will have given up his rights to do industrial or perform industrial services on some portion of the property. Now, the alternative is he may say no.
We don't know.
We don't know.
This comes back to my understanding of settlement options. Is mediation something that would be put in as a suggestion at the point of us submitting our response to litigation, or is that something that would not be available until later?
Facilitative mediation could occur in a couple of different ways. One, the judge could order the parties to go to facilitative mediation. Alternatively, counsel for both sides could essentially recommend it and thus require it. What it takes, though, to be successful is a willingness on both sides to compromise. And at this point in time, I can't tell you how willing Melching Incorporated would be to compromise, and I can't tell you how willing the city commission would be to compromise. For instance, I neither can predict whether Melching Incorporated would be willing to say 50 acres down there can become commercial, nor do I have the ability to say, and the city commission would agree, that 50 acres remain industrial. I've not asked the question, and I've never heard a consensus.
I have one more question. You read it all the time. It's repeated. That the city dropped the ball in 2009 and we should have rezoned then. If we had tried to rezone then, Sappy would have started litigation.
Sure.
That's not a certainty either.
No. No, and I would expect Sappy would have asked for money, and 2 would have said you can't do it anyway. And you don't have insurance coverage for that type of case.
So that, I mean, that's kind of where I'm coming from when I mentioned mediation, is clearly this is gonna have to come down to a negotiation at some point. And if we can suggest a negotiation on the front end instead of the back end, I think that we're gonna provide some kind of resolution to our finances and to residents. So, that's something I'm thinking.
But right now, we have to make a determination on how we are going to enter the fray with the options that we have before us.
How many days have we had before we make this determination?
I haven't, I'm sorry,
No, go right ahead, Council.
we have approximately 14 more days to file an answer. Given that you don't meet again until the second week in January, I would at least like an indication to file the answer.
You just say you and Melchie will be in talks.
Sure.
During that time. Is there a possibility that he would be, due to good talks, let's say perhaps, that he could come to some type of conclusion and just come back to the table and maybe even reconsider and drop his lawsuit and start from the beginning again?
That is always a possibility. I would not expect that to occur. If your thought is do it as opposed to filing an answer, that's not gonna happen in 2 weeks.
Okay.
That's gonna be a much more lengthy conversation. And at some point, the court is going to say, let's go, parties.
For consideration of where things to go, how have our relations been with Mr. Milchin as of late? I know that, I've tried to, I've tried to contact him several times myself, just to meet the gentleman face to face, and I have not heard back from him. And this is prior to litigation, so I just wanna make sure that we feel that we're on good footing with him as opposed to, putting a hand out and not being done.
I believe all the conversations and the meetings that I and our staff have had with Mr. Nelson have been very cordial, and I think for the most part productive. And I don't think that has changed. Now, I haven't talked to him, as I mentioned, I haven't talked to him since the lawsuit was been filed. But up until that time, they've been, as I said, cordial and very productive.
And I would reiterate the same comment relative to conversations between our office and council for Doug Melchin and Melchin Incorporated.
Commissioner?
What, before I have to stop, but within the next 14 days, are you saying we have to choose between A and B?
Yep.
We gotta go one way or the other, there's no option.
I've either got
Gotta
to
do
defend the
one or the
lawsuit
other.
or I've got to,
You can't be mute.
to that effect. If I'm mute, then it's A. If we don't file an answer, then there's no reason not to call Melchin's counsel and say, prepare an order that we agree the zoning was not changed by way of that initiatory petition and vote.
Commissioners, we need to be able to come to some type of consensus so that we can give council direction on which way we're going to proceed, so that we can put it on the agenda for tomorrow's.
Now we have a typical order of proceeding, trying to do things in the request for public comment later, but is it possible to maybe entertain some public comment?
No. We will take public comment, but
Not that we have to.
we will remain silent and not engage because of the lawsuit. We'll be making our determination at this point amongst ourselves as this is presented. Commissioners, could you use the evening to give further consideration to these options? And then we could attempt consensus tomorrow?
Good idea.
Okay. So rank them. We'll have further questions for council tomorrow. Do your homework, so to speak, before you. Okay?
Our email is going to whom?
Pardon me?
The email will go to whom?
No, we'll talk about it tomorrow.
You're asking us to,
No, just rank them, come back, we'll talk about it again tomorrow, and we'll give direction at tomorrow's meeting.
Yeah, please do not do a variety of emails back and forth amongst each other. That was, you had to count 4.
Right. Next item on the agenda is senior transit.
Steve, will you have copies of the attorney's opinion available at the clerk's office? So tomorrow, when you're entertaining your discussion, we'll be able to see what you're talking about.
The communication is covered by attorney-client privilege. It is provided to the 7 of you. The 7 of you have the option to waive that privilege and allow anyone and everyone to see it, or you may keep it for the 7 of you.
Give that consideration as well tonight, and we'll make that determination tomorrow.
So how can we see it before then?
Just a clarification on that, that's something that we would have to vote on collectively and say we're gonna release that document or not.
That's correct.
That is not something that as an individual on this commission, we could choose to release that on our own initiative. So I think if we want to release that document, and perhaps, you know, I would wait for our attorney to perhaps provide some guidance on there before we did that. But I think if we want to have that be a public document, that we need to discuss it in open session and take a vote on whether or not we're gonna make that public or not. Because it would breach the trust amongst ourselves if we violated attorney-client privilege without saying we're gonna waive it as a vote of this body. So I do think we should have that discussion. Unless the attorney says that's a real stupid idea, I would suggest that for the sake of transparency, having those options available to the public is not an unreasonable thing to do. But you might correct me.
My general preference is when I provide advice to the 7 of you is for the eyes and ears of the 7 of you only. On this particular memo, I viewed it to be somewhat unusual and was drafted with the possibility and or concern that it would be seen by people other than the 7 of you. So I don't know that there is anything in this memo that I would find so damning that I would suggest you not do it. I will reiterate though, my general communication is something only for the 7 of you and does include information that is not publicly known and would be damaging to the city if publicly known.
Again, I will suggest that you give it consideration. There doesn't seem to be that much objection to it, but I would support its release, but after we have discussed and reached a consensus tomorrow for direction.
Yeah, what's going to do as good as tomorrow?
There's no point in releasing it tomorrow.
Folks?
Well, I think this, yeah. I think
That's just my preference. I'm throwing it out for discussion right now. I mean, we can.
Well, I mean, what I tried to get when I was asking the city attorney earlier is, I mean, I'm not sure how many times we can say it before it starts to convince a few people that regardless if we had changed the zoning in 2009 or 20 years ago, or changed it tonight, or did nothing, and, you know, unless state law gets changed or a circuit court judge is willing to set precedent, the fact is that this is a legal non-conforming use, and that's gonna continue to be the case regardless of what that zoning may get changed to, unless we are successful in negotiating some alternative with the property, which has been my position all along. So, you know, to me, it doesn't really matter if that's available to the public or not, because our response to the lawsuit, unless some judge decides to really go out on a limb, isn't going to change the outcome in the fact that this is a legal non-conforming use and he can use that property for industrial use. Our best outcome is to sit down in good faith and negotiate with this property owner a better outcome than that.
Well, I would entertain a motion
I would like
to release the information to be filed with the clerk for public access.
I would move that in regards to the memo in question, we waive attorney-client privilege and allow the document to be placed with the city clerk for inspection of the building.
Do we have a roll call, Madam Clerk?
Vice Mayor Spataro?
Yes.
Commissioner German?
Yes.
Commissioner Waringo?
Yes.
Commissioner Chirkowitz?
Yes.
Commissioner Markowski?
Yes.
Mayor Gallagher?
Yes.
Motion passes.
And we will file that this evening, and they'll be available tomorrow. Thank you.
Will be on the internet?
They're asking for the vehicle.
It could be tomorrow.
It'll be in the clerk's office in hard copy.
Did you hear that?
Hard copy.
Your office, hard copy.
I was requested to put it on the internet. No? Okay. Thank you.
You received the city manager's recent memo regarding senior transit. It was tabled from the last commission meeting as it brings up issues of budget and finance and per our commission rules that needs to be discussed in such a form and giving staff time in order to prepare for responses. Just as some background, you weren't on the council at the time. The commission recalls that when the CDBG funding was presented to us, I believe $45,000 of CDBG funding had been eliminated and repurposed, which typically had gone to senior transit, and those monies put into other uses, such as senior weatherization, where we have seniors living in substandard housing in order to allow them to remain and not get cold in the winter time. Other programs such as emergency home repair for impoverished families, for the most part, where we would replace furnaces, water heaters, and roofs, and those type of items. Because those monies were supplemental to regular city funds that made up the other share of the approximately $76,000 to run the program. It was slated then for elimination, especially given our 2012-2013 budget forecast at this point. But I think there still needs to be a realization that we are still operating in a budget deficit, and we are balancing our budget by taking budget stabilization funds, which are very quickly becoming depleted, and is not a situation that we can maintain into the future. Just as a recap on the budget needs, per our 2012-2013 budget information that we received, property taxes will decrease 6% due to general decline in property values brought on by the recession and the housing collapse. We're also expecting the 2012-2013 full negative impact of the Sackey plant closure on property tax values. An unusually large number of property tax appeals have been filed in recent years, and many of these are from large taxpayers and will likely have a negative impact on property taxes for several years, and namely the BC Cobb plant, which we had to return about, what, almost $1 million? Okay, $950,000, and plus the value of their properties was cut approximately in half, correct? Now that largest taxpayer is slated to close or mothballed on January 1st, 2015. Now, that will require continued major restructuring and downsizing of public services for years to come here. And we continue to expect negative factors to outweigh positive ones for the next few years as far as the budget is concerned. If we look at the impact that this budget was submitted, our full-time complement of employees was 233 positions. In the interim, we have eliminated an entire department and privatized the trade inspections department. By way of comparison, in 2002, the city's overall full-time complement was 315 positions. At that point this past summer, there was elimination of 82 positions. 7 firefighter positions were vacated. We vacated a maintenance worker. We eliminated a finance director's position. Our general fund had been required to transfer $160,000, an increase of $60,000 for the Smart Zone debt service, and the $75,000 contribution from the Community Foundation for Muskegon County will disappear at some point as well. And when is that?
2016.
Thank you.
16.
So that gives you just a general idea of some of the issues that we face when we're looking at the budget and our attempts to maintain core services, namely police, fire, public works, and maintaining the infrastructure that the city is required to maintain. Police is very important. Our complement is down from 91 to about 79. And that doesn't just affect us, but everybody within the region, who's in the metro area. Everybody's having a hard time keeping their heads above the water, especially when it comes to public safety. And tragically, the results of that we're seeing this weekend, where multiple departments have to be called in order to protect the public, sharing services due to the fact of many jurisdictions having an inability to maintain a large enough contingent to protect the public. This resulted, sadly, that resulted in the wounding of one of our seasoned officers, and I hope the officer is doing well, and our best wishes to the officer and to the officer's family. So those are the considerations in the cutting of senior transit. And senior transit will not be probably the last program. We will be looking at either this coming budget year or the budget years going into 2015 and beyond. Last summer, when we went through the budget process, we heard 2 nights of testimony or testimonials from individuals about the importance of the program to them, and we appreciate that. At that time, the program could have been eliminated because there was support enough for it. However, the former mayor at that point, in order to engage the citizens, made a suggestion that a ballot proposal be put on the November 2012 elections to see if there was support to float a portion of a mill in order to maintain the program. And he was adamant at that time that if it failed, the program would end. And at that time, he also challenged the proponents of the program to make good on their commitment and go out and campaign for the ballot proposal. So that kind of brings us up to date where we are now. The ballot proposal failed. I know there's some contention that it was confusing, although the ballot language did include in the proposal for the mill that you have to vote for the one underneath this too. So we do rely on an informed electorate, and that means in a Hamiltonian manner that the electorate educates themselves on the matter before them. So that brings us where we are now. And I will let Commissioner Turnquist start.
What is the proper procedure to vote on this issue at tomorrow night's commission meeting? Is there a motion to take it off the table and present it? I mean, you've given a lot of reasons on the downside. We approved the budget 2012, 2013 of X amount of dollars, 24 million something or other, and included in that was taking almost 5 million, or no, not 5 million, but 500,000 out of the general fund and coverings make up the difference between our expected income and that. We received a very good report from Mr. Paul, and we will be less than taking 300,000 out of that for the fiscal year. I just would like to see us vote on this. Sometimes you gotta do the right thing rather than put up all the numbers and say this is $30,000 for the remainder of the year is like 1/100th of a percent of our budget. It's nothing. And all those things you said that we're gonna lose, I just don't agree with that.
Well, you're entitled to your own opinions, but
You're entitled to yours.
But I'm going on, you know, facts on what's actually in the checkbook and what we are facing. Now, if, yes?
Unless there's additional comment, I'm going to look.
Okay, but one thing I didn't want to, you know, ask those, so if we did proceed and fund this to the end of the fiscal year, the program would end June 30th.
Here's my thing. As I've listened to people describe their use of this program over the course of the last year, I'm struck again and again by the number of individuals who describe services being provided by our drivers that they're not actually supposed to do. And actually, by doing so, are exposing to the city to significant liability if it went bad. Now, people may poo-poo that, but I can't govern based on what my gut tells me. I have to use my head, and I have to be responsible. Because, quite frankly, anybody who thinks these things are, well, let's just do the right thing, we have an example right next door in the form of Muskegon Heights Public Schools, what happens when you don't make tough decisions. Eventually, you go over a financial cliff. And we're not in that position because over the last decade, we have made some very unpleasant and in some cases extremely difficult decisions to preserve core services and eliminate entire departments and programs that were extremely popular and extremely important, but they were not a core municipal service. So I do think that we can't just ignore that reality. And we certainly can't afford to take financial risks with our staff doing things that our insurance is not gonna cover because that's not within their work scope. So, having looked at that and listened to those services, a lot of what we're hearing described is not a transportation service. It's actually a form of home health aid service, of which there are programs available through federal funding, locally available to provide that level of assistance so seniors can stay independent and stay in their home. And the reason for that is Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security have learned that it's much less expensive to pay pennies up front to help seniors stay in their home and stay independent than for them to lose those options and end up in long-term care, which is the single most expensive option. And quite frankly, often leads to a much shorter life expectancy for the person involved. So, one, I think we need to look beyond just a transportation program. The second thing is just spending $30,000. And, you know, I haven't worked in a job where making a lot of money has been important to me. That's never been my priority. So from my perspective, $30,000 is a lot of money. That's not inconsequential. That's a lot of money. That's half a police officer. And so I don't take those kind of decisions lightly. So if we just do nothing and extend this program, and then it drops off later on, we've spent money and accomplished what? You know, I don't see the benefit of that. So I think if we're serious about providing a transportation service, we have some options before us. We can modify the existing program so that it's more self-supporting and that our general fund expenditures are reduced based on our financial reality as outlined very well by the mayor. We could potentially take another run at finding local partners who, for a reduced cost from our general fund, might be willing to provide an enhanced service to our existing seniors. And keep in mind, we're talking about approximately 160 individuals. You know, when we're looking for the amount of money we spend for the number of individuals being served, obviously if you're one of those 160 individuals, that's very important to you. But in the city of 40,000, we have to be mindful that the other 40,000 people have things that are important to them as well. So if we can find a partner where these services could be at least partly replaced at a reduced cost, I think it might be worth taking another look at that. So I'm not opposed to maintaining some sort of program necessarily, but I do think that just saying we're going to fund it as it is for another arbitrary period of time is just kicking the can down the road. And I think the public deserves better from us than that. So, you know, those are my ideas, is that either we just are honest with people and say we just don't have the money to continue to do this, we direct staff to negotiate with a potential partner, or we look at changing the fee structure and the other structure as far as time and availability and those things, so that this is more of a self-supporting program. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Question, what was the last fee that was raised for this service?
Yeah, and starting in July 1st, we raised the one-way fee from $1.50 to $3.
And how far does that get someone? As far as how far can they go in a $3 one-way ride?
I can tell you.
Again, the boundaries
The
of the
boundaries,
service
okay.
are the city limits to the north and west, Seminole to the south, and Sheridan to the east.
I did suggest last couple meetings that we needed to look at other options for providing the service on a long-term basis. It's been made clear that there are many residents who are in need of the service that picks them up from their home because they are mostly independent and gets them to where they want to be, which may not be a medical appointment. Many people just want to get where they'd like to go, and have some assistance in getting there. And so I did make as many phone calls as I was able to try to see if there was someone who's already providing that service, and maybe we just hadn't connected people with them. I did locate a local transportation company based here downtown, Total Care Transportation. I did ask them before discussing the matter, what services do you provide? How much notice do you need? They told me they only need 24 hours notice before they schedule a ride. They told me that their standard regular price is for a round trip ride, $30. And that is much higher than what we are currently offering our residents. I did ask them if someone needs help getting in and out of the vehicle, do you provide them with that service? She said certainly, because they normally also provide wheelchair transportation. So they're used to providing that service. That is part of what they do. They take people to non-medical appointments. So after that part of the conversation, I asked her, I said, well, we're looking at what our options could be to serve the city residents. And without much prompting at all, they replied with an email that they were willing to cut that price for the city of Muskegon residents in half. So at this point in time, they have made publicly available within a 10-mile round trip, so it would pretty much fall within our city boundaries, that you can get a ride through this agency, this company, for $18. Now that is still much more than what our residents are currently paying, and they're clearly low-income seniors who are using our service because it helps them with their budget. But my question is whether it might be possible, as this company has clearly offered, very quickly and without hesitation, the desire to serve citizens more than they are already doing so. If there's something we might be able to provide that can help us get closer where we want to be and not be under the obligation of providing that service. And here's why I don't think that it makes sense in the long term right now for us to provide that service, is because I think our purpose as municipal government is to provide for public safety, it is to provide for our infrastructure, and it is to help our citizens obtain a diverse economy that is sustainable. And so it's clearly important, these social services for our residents, but I'm not sure that we are the body that should be providing those social services. However, I do think that it is in our best interest and theirs to try to put our residents together with those services whenever possible. And so I'm wondering if there are any thoughts on perhaps providing some type of funding to allow them to provide that service for a cheaper cost.
No, it's one way, so she did 18 round trip, so 6 round trip, 3 times.
Just trying to get that through my head.
And I have not made that specific agreement with them. I've not said, how much money would it cost you to reduce that. That was where I got at the point in the conversation. So that would be something that I think maybe city staff could determine that company, but I don't know if there's any interest to do that.
Question, Mayor. Looking at the transit program that we're looking at now, and that's on the table, are there any other options that we looked at that we possibly may be cutting? And if we do cut this program, how would those dollars that would have been used here be allocated elsewhere? Where would they be allocated?
Well, we had gone through that entire process during the budget period, Commissioner.
Okay.
And we had all unanimously, approved the cutting of the $45,000 from the CDBG. And, it's like, yeah, we can cut it from somewhere. But as it was stated during this budget process, is that somewhere is, if you want me to line up, 3 or 4 city employees, which one you want to pick? And the then mayor at that point was as succinct and was that, brash in his illustration as well. Because that's where it's at. We have departments that are shadows of themselves. We just eliminated a department.
Which
of bringing stuff into the coffers. Again, we have a balanced budget, but we're using our piggy bank to close the gap.
Well, it's balanced if you think that having over $200,000 in negative cash flow is balanced.
Right.
The fact is that we have negative cash flow, and any business that operates with negative cash flow eventually goes belly up. And so we have money in the bank to allow us to operate with negative cash flow in the short term. Adding to that, in my mind, is irresponsible. So, I mean, I think that's, unpleasant as it may be, is our harsh reality, and has been for some time. I think if we decide to move forward, that we've heard there might be a possibility here of partnering, as we did with many of our leisure services programs, that if we move in that direction, then we should make a motion and direct city staff to make that contact to see if that is a possibility and what that might cost, and bring it back to us in a, we'd have to, given the holidays, they have to have a reasonable period of time to get back to us, to see if that's a possibility. But I mean, I think quite honestly, if we're gonna sustain this over the longer term, that may be the way to go. And that way we have a fixed cost, for this. I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, I just heard that at best case scenario, we might end up paying $150,000 in legal fees we don't have in our budget either. So,
City manager, yes.
Well, and maybe I can say a couple things, and hopefully it will clear up what Commissioner German was asking. In terms of the money for the senior transit program, I think you were asking if the program didn't continue, where would the money that was allocated for it go? There was not money allocated for the program from now until the end of the fiscal year. And so you don't have to worry about where that money would go, because there isn't.
There isn't any.
The other thing that I would say in terms of partnering with somebody else, we did have some conversations with other agencies, but they were nonprofit, not a for-profit company like Total Care Transportation. So we did not have that conversation. But what I would say is whoever we would look to partner with, I think it comes down to money. And, it's a matter of if we're going to partner with somebody and there's going to be additional rides, then there's going to be additional costs, and somebody needs to bear those costs. The question comes, if we're going to continue to participate financially in some way, then why wouldn't we just run our own program? Unless we can reduce our costs in some significant way. Their program sounds like it's significantly different than ours.
I think the other thing you have to determine too is that even if we were supplementing under a contract with a partner, where would those monies come from? I mean, a substantial amount had come out of community block development grants, but we've gone from about $1.5 million when I first came on the commission down to $800,000, and those keep on disappearing.
they're gonna sequester right off the fiscal.
And they're gonna sequester right off the fiscal cliff. And as far as, out of our
It's on the
general
table.
fund, it's not doable. Now, the other thing you have to keep in mind too, commissioners, is that this week in Lansing, the Senate and the House have gone ahead with the elimination of the personal property tax without replacing the 20%. Supposedly, we'll be made whole by 80, but there's no guarantee of 20. The manager and I, last Monday, attended a governor's meeting in Lansing with other urban mayors and managers, and Lieutenant Governor Cayley was there, and he was hoping to slow down the process, but that didn't happen at all, and could not give us much comfort in his prognostications. So right now for municipalities, it's a big, bad, scary world. some that are in scarier positions than we are, to the point where they're saying, why the heck doesn't the government just, Lansing just let us, unify with the county so that we can just get out of the business of being a city?
Well, part of the other portion of my reasoning thus far is that the other part of this is we're looking at a supplemental program, a program that's in addition to what those core services are. And in my mind, there have been many opportunities to do other supplemental programming that involves our core services. So for instance, home rehabilitation has had to have been cut. And our core services involve keeping our citizens in a city with homes and developing the land that we have in a sustainable manner. And it's not to say that I don't think that senior transit is important, but what I think is that the funds that we have, when we have them available in supplement, they need to supplement our core services. And that also comes down to fire prevention, public safety, services that help reduce our crime rate. And so I'm just not sure that we're going to get the benefits that we're looking for towards our core services with this program. It doesn't mean that the service doesn't need to be provided, but I'm not sure that it was.
Thank you. Again, last year when it was submitted for elimination, there was a sheet of options, presented, and staff had vetted these agencies. By the testimonials that we've heard, of course, they were not as convenient as ours. The Vice Mayor did point out, again, that one of the issues is that part of the convenience was our employees working outside of their work rules, which, it's a risk for them, it's a risk for the rider, it's a risk for the citizenry. Commissioner Turnquist, you were of a mind to make a motion tomorrow, I believe, correct?
A motion would be appropriate tomorrow evening?
That's yes.
Okay.
Item 3, closure of Beach Street during the winter months.
I laid out for you in a, part of my update last week that we've had on a number of occasions, this isn't anything new, but with our dwindling resources, we're trying to be more efficient. We are finding ourselves closing a section of Beach Street more and more because of the blowing sand between Beecher Park and Lakeshore Drive, particularly closest to the water filtration plant. And we have closed that area on a number of occasions for sometimes prolonged periods of time because of the sand, the fact that we just can't keep it open. And so we've had some discussion about the possibility of just simply closing that section during the winter months. But we wanted to have some discussion with the city commission about that possibility and see what your thoughts and reaction were before we proceed with anything along those lines.
Well, why don't we start with our resident beachcomber?
Haven't we done that before, though, in the winter?
Well, we close it, and on occasion, and a lot of times it's on overtime or on weekends, and so it costs us money. But we have closed that section for, I say prolonged periods of time, but not
Not
the whole,
No.
not the whole winter or a month or two that I can remember.
I don't know why, but what months are we
Well,
proposing?
we would, I would think we'd probably close it now and then reopen it as soon as the weather breaks.
December 1
Probably
through March 30.
in March sometime.
Commissioner?
Would it remain open to the water filtration so the employees can get to that far?
They don't go that way.
It would.
They don't go that way.
And how much money are we gonna save by doing this?
you know, I don't know, probably enough to fund senior transit, no, I'm. It really comes out of another, really fun, but, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be, it's hard to say how much it saves us. You know, if we close the street during regular work hours, then, you know, we're using existing staff time. Most of the time, quite frankly, it's after hours or it's during, the weekend, so we're paying overtime and that. And then again, it depends on how often we close it and reopen it, so it's kinda hard to say. Mo, could you give a guess about, how much it costs each time, I guess each time, we close it and have to reopen?
I probably, first of all, if I may, it would not fund senior transit because it's major streets.
I corrected myself.
But, we probably average about, I know you don't, you never did anyway, so. But we probably average about 5 hours a week, during those months, so you're talking probably 20 hours of overtime, roughly, depending on how the wind blows.
And we're not just talking snow, we're talking the sand.
Sand is the biggest problem.
Sand is the big issue.
Sand is the biggest problem for us from a safety, aside from even, you know, aside from the cost itself, but you still have the safety issues around those curves.
Are we discussing the entire, closure of the entire Beach Street from Dune to Lake Shore, or just the portion in front of the water filtration?
No, the portion in front of the water filtration plant, all the way around to Beechwood Park. So about to Dune Street.
Here's a concern I have with that. Clearly you can get to Pure Marquette Park from, you know, if you continue to Beach Street. However, a lot of people, and myself included, there's not a whole lot to do in the winter around here. And to be honest, for many people, there's not a whole lot to do in the winter. And one of the few things they do is drive out and look at the lake. They might not get out and play in it, but they do drive out and look at it. And I'm worried from a local and a tourism perspective that we are cutting off a very big viewshed of one of our major resources.
But they still go.
Do you want to?
If I may, I mean, the parking lot itself will stay open. The parking lot at Peach Street and Lake Shore Drive, access to it, we'll have to keep it open, if nothing else, for access to the filtration plant employees. So that gives you the most of, I guess, the parking spaces are available. We'll make sure that those are available for that tourism. And then we're gonna have some signs saying the road the road closed ahead, that will send people down to Lake Shore Drive coming out.
Both parking lots at Beechwood Park will remain open as well for people to walk on the boardwalk.
And that's really the most activity generating facility out there is the Beechwood Park because of the, the slides and the fire pits and stuff like that.
And so the boardwalk would remain open
Oh, yes.
along
Oh,
the
yes, yes.
It's just the traffic access because of the impediments with the sand. Vice Mayor?
My concern, I mean, I certainly understand, because it's closed practically every other week as it is, and, I can understand just closing it and not dealing with it until the spring when you start taking the snow fences up. But my concern would be, I mean, unless I'm wrong, my understanding has always been if we lost Beach Street for whatever reason, we'd never be able to put it back in. Do we endanger that at all by closing it off seasonally?
If anything, I think we would be prolonging its life because of the less use, if you will, during the.
Well, I'm talking about if it gets to the point where it's completely buried by the end of the season, would that raise even the possibility that we wouldn't be allowed to dig it back out and reuse it?
No, mobile issue,
we
you
will.
shovel and out you go.
We're not creating a dune that we have to.
That's my concern.
No, we will not let it get to that point where it becomes a nightmare to open it up in the spring, even if we have to get in there in the interim and kind of reduce the amount of sand collected on it or accumulating on top of the surface. We'll have to do it even though the road might be closed, if you approve that, obviously.
What he's saying is the benefit of that would be they could do it at their leisure, during their day hours, as opposed to having to get the road over
without much interruption, if you will. Nowadays, what we're doing is we're sending out the notices to the Chronicle and Facebook and different places, hey, the road is closed tomorrow because of the high wind and we cannot, high winds and we can't keep up with it. Well, that sense, you know, everybody gets used to it, that it's closed and we'll open it up as well.
What if it's 75 in February?
If you can sign off, that it will be 75, so we'll keep it open.
I mean, it's not unlikely. I went for a 24-mile bike ride in February last year because it was almost 70.
We'll keep the bike lane open. That's for
And as
sure.
I told the vice mayor, Mo will issue you a shovel.
So, would we anticipate any kind of reaction to the use of the dog beach? I don't know how many people go down there in the winter months, it's probably just a handful, I would think, but,
I can still.
I think with
We'll
the-
get to it.
I think with the ability to park at Beechwood Park, that would take away this thing of if somebody wants to walk the dogs, they can park at Beechwood Park, which is probably 400 feet, 500 feet.
That's not the designated dog beach, but, people are allowed to have their dogs on the beach during those winter months. But that area is not the designated dog beach.
One of the things people lose sight of with our beach is that dogs are banned from a part of it, basically from Memorial Day to Labor Day. It's all dog beach the rest of the time.
right.
You just gotta clean up after
Yes,
yourself.
please. Thank you, Mo. So what do you need from us regarding this? A head nod, do you need anything official, a show of hands?
Not necessarily official, but, if there was some, real concerns about it, we would do it. If you're okay with it, then, we're likely to go ahead with it.
I'd say, give it a whirl and see how it, works out for this season. Commissioners? Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Welcome. Any other business? Vice Mayor?
Yeah, I think I owe all of you an explanation. There's been a couple of news stories, or more than a couple. And so I just want to kind of apprise you with what I've done, going to the jail selection committee the last 2 Thursdays. I was participant, I know some of you participated in the public charrette process over the course of this year. There were 88 different sites that were reviewed, including McLaughlin School. My understanding from the people who've been directly involved in that process, and I've kept in touch with a number of them, were that they had basically settled on the Roundy's building for the new location for the jail, and then at kind of the 11th hour, the judges said, wait a minute, the jail has to be connected to the courthouse for whatever reasons they felt that that was important to them. It started coming out the end of October, beginning of November, that suddenly 2 options that were not included in the public charrette process at all were suddenly on the table for discussion. One of them being building a new facility attached to the existing jail, which had not been discussed at any point along the way. And then the second one was the use of Craig School, which is on the corner of Park and Forest, but includes that entire block. I was very concerned about that. I've talked to members of the committee about that. I know most of them. And I was hoping that we would not have gotten to the point that we were. It came to my attention that the agenda for their meeting on November 29th was that their consulting firm was going to make their final recommendation. Well, when you get to the final recommendation, I think that's at the point you gotta make sure that if you're not comfortable with that recommendation, you speak out. And that final recommendation was to build a basically new jail facility on the Pine Street right-of-way between Amity and Walton. And in the schematic that they showed, it showed a single corridor connecting what is essentially a standalone building to the existing jail building. The other final final recommendation was the use of the Craig School property for the new juvenile transition center. Now, in that presentation, they indicated that the building is in rough shape. Apparently, gymnasiums are the end-all and be-all for this process, because despite their desire for that site, they indicated that they would have to build an entirely new wing to the building for detention purposes. So that's after talking with the mayor and the manager. I was kind of hoping that the mayor would be there. My neighborhood association president had contacted me as well, William Parker, who is the Nelson Neighborhood Improvement Association president. But given that the meeting was at 1:30 in the afternoon, and there was extremely short notice on what the agenda was, it was not really possible for many of my neighbors to get the day off of work and be able to go and speak out. Mr. Parker was able to attend, and I was able to attend. And so I indicated that based on discussions with the mayor and the manager, and the fact that this is the first time there was availability for public discussion on this topic, that I was speaking on behalf of the city of Muskegon as vice mayor. That wasn't any more than talking after consulting with the mayor and the manager. But that closing off Pine Street was inconsistent with what we've been doing for the last decade or so in economic redevelopment, as far as reopening the street grid, creating a healthy traffic pattern for downtown, because that's how we, the research has shown that that's what we need to do in order to reestablish the economic vitality of our core downtown area. So this really would have been a big step backward. And then when you look at the importance of Pine Street as our original main street, and the fact that there are a significant number of businesses on there, starting at Apple, going all the way to Western, and not only existing businesses that pay property taxes and income taxes, but also some attractive commercial properties that hopefully will be occupied in the near future and bring additional tax revenue into the community and additional economic activity in the community. But closing off the streets like having a heart attack. It just takes one little blockage in one little part of the artery, and everything after that is in trouble. And you can survive that, but you get enough of that, the person dies. And we kind of had that near-death experience about a decade ago. So I expressed to them that as a standalone building, that this could be a compromise situation where they either elevated that single corridor or built it as a tunnel, and that if they felt that they needed additional parking because this would take up more of their parking lot, that we certainly could work with them from a planning perspective to look at that area on the north side of Walton or the south side of Amity for additional satellite parking if needed. I drive on Spring Street on a regular basis, and I can tell you the eastern third of that parking lot's usually empty. So I don't think it's a given that they would actually need additional satellite parking. I said, on the other hand, with Craig School, that is completely for the same reasons that McLaughlin School were inappropriate. Any kind of facility that brings traffic and noise, because you're going to have the dumpsters being empty at 6 a.m., because that's where they do all the other commercial buildings in the neighborhood. You have people coming to visit, you have the employees coming and going, you have all of that. And there are single-family homes on all four sides of that property. And it's not necessarily that it's not the city, it's just, I don't care what city you're in, that's an inappropriate location for that kind of activity. And the fact is that the school can go there, because schools can build wherever they want, regardless of zoning. There's no local way to veto that. But when the school leaves, then the underlying zoning reverts, and we have the final say, and that is zoned single-family residential. And there's a lot of hardworking people who live adjacent to that property and nearby who've invested in their homes and look to us to protect their investment. So that's why I spoke out. I can tell you that I spoke privately with most of the elected officials involved in this process over the course of those 2 weeks, because I did go back on December 6th speak out again a little more bluntly. And some of the county staff involved, and I do get the sense that there is a willingness to compromise on this issue. My assertion to them is that we need to sit down as the city and county and work these issues out, because if they go down the path that their final recommendations included, and, you know, we say no, that's a lot of tax dollars wasted, and that's not in anybody's best interest. And that doesn't mean we're opposed to a new jail or a new youth home, but these were options that nobody had an opportunity to comment on before. So I just appreciate you allowing me to explain why I went to that. It was more a matter of short notice and availability, and why I said what I said. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, or either now or after the meeting. And like I said, I know most of the people involved on this committee, and I do think that there seems to be a willingness to be flexible on these issues, and hopefully we can get a positive outcome for our downtown redevelopment out of this. So, thank you for allowing me to offer that explanation here.
It's all right, Vice Mayor.
Two, not really a question for him, two other things. Many of us were invited, probably all of us, to the Burnside Neighborhood Association regarding some tree issues. And I know that you were there, and I was also here, so I didn't know if you had a chance to kind of update us on that, or and have the opportunity to attend.
Hey, Mo.
Yeah, because he's still here, so.
We had the meeting, it was the 28th of November, and it was very well attended, if I recall correctly. I think we had probably over, would you say 25, 30?
Oh,
At least 30 people. It went very well. The conclusion that we came to, as I understand it, is that the width of the street was going to be, curb and go, but the width of it is going to be 31 back to back. And the estimated number of trees that would have to be removed is probably between 15 and 20 trees, is what we had discussed at the meeting. Granted that the actual design has not been completed yet, so an exact number of trees to be removed is not known yet. The issue or the concern was over the oak wilt disease. What I was able to do before the meeting, I think, came up with a study by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that showed there's some ways that you can deal with potentially diseased oak wilt trees by removing them deep and using some what they call, I guess, tree paint. And I believe we left the meeting with those consensus that the project was not going to be designed or bid probably until maybe February, March, and construction would start on probably April and completed before the end of June. I also did commit that we would replant bunch of trees or plant bunch of trees at the conclusion of the project, that the city would go out there and plant some trees. Did I miss anything?
So the resolution to the concern for the oak wilt was that you're going to dig deeper when you remove them, and that you're going to paint the base of it. Is that the white paint?
The surface where we cut them out.
Oh, okay,
where
so
we
you're
cut the stump.
painting the ground.
If we remove them after April 1st, April 15th, which is the deadline established. Now, if we're lucky and we can finish the design before, and we can bid the project and find out if it is within the budgeted amount, and we have a contractor on board before April 15th, we might be able to have that contractor go out